Hello, true crimeers. Final Destination. It's a series of movies. I think they're on number 567 at this point. Well, if you don't know, it's a series of horror movies where people cheat death only for death to re-find them, I'm assuming using Google Maps, and they kill them. Kills them anyway, so they find a way to murder the person who avoided the death they were supposed to have. And usually it's in a pretty gruesome way, like getting sliced in half by like a piece of glass that two movers are moving, you know, in this position for some reason. Well, sometimes this happens in real life, just not as you know, gory as the movies show. So this is another TikTok compilation. I got another warning on TikTok, so I really need to get these things over here ASAP. So these are 12 real-life cases where people survived some sort of horrific event, possibly cheated death, only to, unfortunately, die sometime later in a, you know, non-natural causes kind of way, usually. Without further ado, here are 12 Final Destination in real-life stories. Viewer discretion is advised. No. Cheating death may be luck for some, but a curse for others. Hello, true crimeers. This is Final Destination in real life. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was Hilda Yolanda Mayol. At the beginning of this story, she lived in New York City. Now, she worked at the World Trade Center at a restaurant on the ground floor. She was there that morning on September 11th, 2001. When the first plane struck the first building, she was there to witness it. She felt it. But again, luckily, she was on the ground floor of the building, so she managed to escape and would survive the 9/11 attack. Unfortunately for thousands of others, they were not so lucky. Obviously, the restaurant she worked in was destroyed, but she got out with her life. 2 months later, on November 12th, 2001, she had booked a flight to the Dominican Republic to go back home. She was planning to go visit some family. So she boarded American Airlines Flight 587, taking off from JFK Airport. Sadly, the flight did not last too long, because shortly after takeoff, due to a vertical stabilizer issue due to pilot error, they lost control of the plane. The plane took off at 9:14 a.m., and approximately at 9:16 a.m., it crashed into the Bell Harbor neighborhood of Queens, New York. Every passenger and crew member, 260 people on board, died on impact. Luckily, on the ground, there were only 5 casualties, but it could have been a lot worse. So 2 months and 1 day after she survived the 9/11 attacks, Hilda would die in a plane crash in New York. To make matters a little more eerie and just sort of coincidental, Flight 587 was cleared for takeoff at 9:11 a.m. And that was one of many Final Destination stories that happened in real life. They would survive an earthquake, but then they would die when people were trying to survey the damage from above. Hello, true crimeers. This is another Final Destination in real life. Viewer discretion is advised. In September 2017, near the capital of Mexico, a massive earthquake would strike, and it would destroy buildings, it would topple homes, and it would claim the lives of nearly 400 people. Then just a few months later, in Oaxaca, Mexico, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck again. This time, buildings were destroyed, but not one person died. Which, if you do not know, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake is huge. They are utterly terrifying to live through, and it's extremely rare that you get out of one of those types of earthquakes without one casualty, but that's what happened. So now, within a few months of each other, two huge earthquakes strike, and people are understandably scared to sleep in their homes. Because a third earthquake, you wouldn't get that lucky, right? Your home can crash in on top of you. So shortly after the second earthquake, a large group of people would decide to camp outside. Because, they were afraid. As this group was sleeping, and this consisted of men, women, children, a military helicopter was circling the area, just surveying the damage from the earthquake. The helicopter, which was trying to land, something went wrong with the pilot, and it crashed into the ground. Where did the helicopter crash? Well, on top of the large group of people who were sleeping outside because they were afraid of the earthquakes. Now, no one in the helicopter itself died. There were some injuries, but all of the damage was done to the people sleeping below. The crash, and I don't want to show too much, well, it killed 14 people, including children, and then it injured at least 16 more. So you survive an earthquake, which is very hard to, run from. There's nowhere to run, only to die in a large open field when a helicopter pilot doesn't know how to land. To be so lucky to die in such a tragically unlucky way. From a danger you didn't even know existed. And from what I can tell, no one was held criminally responsible. Hello, true crimerers. This is Final Destination in Real Life. Number 3, viewer discretion. Is advised. Pictured here was the charismatic and totally adventurous 63-year-old Bob Bickerdike. Bob was a father of 6 adult children. He was a pilot, and this is a man who just had a zest for life, and people would say he was just always smiling, so here you go. He was also a hot air balloon pilot. He was absolutely qualified and completely experienced in operating these. In February of 2011, he was on vacation and having a great time with some friends. His friends also had their own hot air balloon that they were piloting. On that February 2011 day, they were flying their balloons over the beautiful French Alps, which the French Alps, of course, are in France. Now, Bob was alone in his hot air balloon basket, and his other 2 friends were in their hot air balloon. Something then went wrong with Bob's balloon. It began to deflate, and so it was sort of slowly descending towards the mountainside, making it become completely uncontrollable. There was nothing that Bob did wrong that caused this to happen. And once this is uncontrollable and you're flying towards a mountainside, it's like, you really don't know what's going to happen. But thankfully, his balloon landed relatively safely on a hilltop. So he survived a hot air balloon crash. I know I've covered at least 1 or 2 stories similar to this where it definitely ends in horrific tragedy. Now, Bob immediately contacted his friends on his phone. He said, "I'm all right, I'm good." And his friends expected him just to stay right there and they would get him, rescued. But when the helicopter would arrive a little bit later, they saw the flattened balloon, but they didn't see Bob. This is because Bob decided to try to walk down the mountainside. By the time he made that decision, it was already starting to get dark outside, and the conditions obviously were snowy and icy. And during his walk down, he slipped on some ice, and he fell down a ravine that was right next to him. He would fall a relatively long distance, and he died on impact. It's not known why Bob decided to walk down the hill on his own, but unfortunately, had he just stayed where he was, he would have been rescued and he would have been perfectly fine. Bob is remembered by his friends and family, and his friends have even made remarks that Bob was not the type of guy to just go peacefully in his sleep. So in a way, this was almost fitting for someone like Bob. Rest in peace, sir. Hello, true crimerers. It's time for Final Destination in Real Life number 4. This one involves 2 people. Viewer discretion is advised. 6 years ago today, on June 12th, 2016, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, would experience one of the most horrific mass shootings in this country. 49 people would be murdered that evening at the gay nightclub. An additional 53 people were injured. Surviving that evening, Chris Broadman. The 34-year-old man was on the nightclub's patio celebrating a friend's birthday when the shooting began. He managed to come out unscathed and unharmed. Also there that night was 20-year-old Jackie Sevilla. The night of the shooting, she was there with some friends from her football team. Most of her friends and teammates were able to escape the shooting, but she was stuck behind. Her and two of her friends managed to hide, but unfortunately, one of them would still end up being shot and killed. 3 months after the shooting, on September 11th, 2016, Chris Broadman would be at a friend's house in Tampa, Florida, celebrating a birthday. And all of a sudden, his friends found him dead on the ground. He died of a very sudden and rare brain hemorrhage. It just out of nowhere took him out. 1 year after the shooting at the nightclub, Jackie would get into a head-on collision on the freeway. In Central Florida around midnight on May 29th, 2017, her 2008 Mitsubishi Lancer would cross over the median and she struck head-on a 2016 Dodge Durango. She died on impact, as did unfortunately someone else in the other vehicle. Both would survive a mass tragedy, only to die in their own individual tragedies, proving that in a snap of a finger, in a heartbeat, it could all be over. This is Final Destination in Real Life, number 5. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 25-year-old mother Brittany Leith. She was the mother of a 3-year-old girl. People described her as the absolute best mother in the world, and her daughter Zoe just adored her. She had recently gotten divorced, but she was living with her grandmother. On the evening of November 29th, 2015, she would leave her daughter at home with the grandma, and she would go out for a night of fun with her friend. A little after 3:30 in the morning, she was on her way home, and she was on a highway in Long Island, New York. At approximately 3:54 a.m., her vehicle struck the median, and her car completely flipped over. And this happened at a relatively high speed, and her car skid for a little bit. Unbelievably, she managed to survive the accident. She was, injured, but she was able to unbuckle herself and get out of the vehicle. She went over to the shoulder of the road to sit with another pedestrian who had stopped. They had obviously already called the police and an ambulance. Her car was in pretty bad shape. This wasn't like a small little fender bender, so she truly was lucky to survive this. But Brittany realized that she had belongings in the car that she desperately needed. So she told them, I need to go over and get some stuff out of my car. The pedestrians who were with her told her to please not do that. They tried to stop her, but she went anyway. She had crossed back over the road where cars were driving at normal speed. And as she was trying to run across the highway, a vehicle hit her at full speed. Brittany was pronounced dead at the scene. I don't know the circumstances of what caused her initial accident, but regardless, she was lucky to survive it. And then moments later, she would die anyway. Her daughter is now being taken care of and raised by her family. It's crazy because in an instant, without even thinking about it, everything that you have lived up for could be gone like that. This is Final Destination Stories in Real Life, number 6. Viewer discretion is advised. And hello, true crimerers. This is the story of Dean Higgins. Dean and Wendy Higgins were originally from Adelaide, Australia. They were a happily married couple, absolutely in love with one another. And they also had a daughter at home. They were adventure seekers and they loved hiking, and in 2013, they flew to Tibet and were going to attempt to climb Mount Everest. They were a part of a large tour group, and when night fell, they set up their tents and would camp out for the night. But then something horrible would happen that night. An avalanche would quickly crawl down the mountain. it would completely swallow up the entire campsite, and this affected somewhere over 125 people. Dean and his wife and their 2 friends that were there with them, they were under 6 feet of snow. The 2 of them were trapped inside their tent, and Dean had fallen on top of his wife, Wendy. Wendy was obviously terrified, as anyone would be, and she was begging Dean to try to dig them out, and he began to work. They were trapped under the snow for an unbelievable 6 hours, and Dean dug them out. He saved his wife and their 2 friends. Unfortunately, I don't know the outcome to all the other people that were part of the group. But Dean was a hero. He saved 3 people that day. He would be determined that he and his wife get to go home to see their daughter. Once they were all out of the snow, they would begin a long journey to descend down Mount Everest. It would be about an 8-hour journey down. Dean, his wife, and their 2 friends, and again, I don't know about the others, they got to the bottom. They got to their base camp. And when they did, Dean collapsed right there. And sadly, he would never wake up again. After surviving the avalanche, after being buried under the snow for 6 hours, after digging his wife and their friends out of the snow and saving their lives, Dean would still die 8 hours later of hypothermia. Wendy was obviously devastated, as was their daughter, but she was also incredibly grateful that he saved her life so that she could see her daughter again. Dean was an awesome man. He was a brave soul, described as a loving man with a beautiful soul. Imagine surviving a plane crash, only to be killed by those there to rescue you. Hello, true crimerers. This is another Final Destination case in real life. Viewer discretion is advised. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 took off from a South Korean airport on July 6, 2013. The flight would be taking its passengers to San Francisco, California. The flight itself, even though it took off 34 minutes late, it went smoothly. At 11:21 a.m., it was cleared for a visual approach at the San Francisco International Airport. However, when it came to the landing portion of the flight, it apparently was coming in too low and too slow. Apparently, the pilot then turned off autopilot, and they went into manual mode, but apparently they were still going too slow. It would come out later that the pilot received very inadequate training, and he was allegedly relying too much on the automated systems. So at 11:28 a.m., the plane would crash just before hitting the runway. The landing gear crashed into the seawall, and then the left engine and the tail section separated from the airplane. The plane then basically slid down the path. There was then a ruptured oil tank, and the oil leaked from that into the hot engine, and then it caused it to ignite. Now, there were 307 total souls on board, and unbelievably, almost all of them survived. There were 187 people who did experience some severe injuries. In the end, there would be 3 reported deaths. 2 of those deaths were teenage girls who actually were thrown from the wreckage. One of those girls was Yi Menyuen, and she survived being thrown from the airplane. Her survival was confirmed by the coroner later. So what had happened was that the fire trucks were spraying the, foam everywhere to put out the fire. And Yi was actually essentially buried underneath the foam. There was a point allegedly on one of the firemen's helmet cams where they could see that she was still there and still alive. But then later she would be discovered deceased. You see, because the fire truck over there, it was driving forward, and Yi was sort of kind of where that little yellow tarp was, and she was run over. She was run over by the fire truck. Now, to the driver of the fire truck's credit, they did not see her because she was covered underneath all the foam. But later the coroner would confirm that she was killed by blunt force trauma, something similar to being run over by a vehicle. A lawsuit was filed by her family, but eventually they withdrew it. This is Final Destination in Real Life number 8. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 46-year-old Jeffrey Howell of Pearl River, Louisiana. Jeffrey was an active fisher, a hunter. He was very involved in his community. Jeffrey was very big on family. He was a very loving individual, always had a smile on his face. He had a very calm demeanor, but he would also stand up for someone if he felt they were being wronged. In June of 2018, along the Pearl River, Jeffrey was out with some friends near a sandbar. They were just trying to have a good, relaxing time when they noticed a group of younger people, somewhere in their 20s. They were throwing just beer bottles and garbage into the Pearl River. And this, understandably, upset Jeffrey. Jeffrey approached them and just politely asked them to stop littering in the river. Well, these young 20-somethings, they didn't like that. So an altercation broke out, and Jeffrey had no choice but to try to defend himself. The other group included 22-year-old Alden Kindergren, 21-year-old Cameron Alfonso, and then 20-year-old Blaine Manel. Jeffrey was struck several times by fists and also by glass beer bottles. A majority of the blows that he took went straight to his head. At some point during the altercation, he collapsed to the ground and stopped moving. Jeffrey Howell had died. The coroner would report that he died of blunt force trauma. Some of the hits that he took came really close to a very fresh scar on his head. What is the cheating death aspect of this case? 1 month prior to this altercation, Jeffrey had a large brain tumor removed from his head. It gave Jeffrey a new lease on life. He was excited that he got to keep going. His family said he was very hopeful for the future now. You know, he basically was told, you get to survive this. You've made it. And then less than a month later, he's just savagely beaten down by a bunch of young hoodlums. The 3 individuals were all arrested, and Alfonso and Kindergren had been charged with second-degree murder after their manslaughter charges were upped. Blaine Manel was also charged with his murder, but the 3 of them have not gone to trial yet as far as I could tell, because I can't find any updates on this case. But I sincerely hope that Jeffrey Howell gets his justice. A stuntman who defied death would be outdone in the most mundane of ways. Hello, true crimerers. This is Final Destination in Real Life. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here behind me is the absolutely gorgeous Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is 3 separate waterfalls that converge, and this is along the border of both Canada and New York. Over the years, a staggering 5,000 plus people have attempted to go over Niagara Falls, and some of this is for self-unaliving purposes, some of it has been accidental, some of it is because they are trying to defy the odds. At least 19 people have tried to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. The very first person to ever succeed going over the waterfall? This lady right here. On October 24th, 1901, 63-year-old Annie Taylor succeeded in going over the waterfalls in a barrel. Not to be outdone, stunt performer and Barnum and Bailey's circus performer, Bobby Leach, well, he was going to attempt it as well. So this was his barrel. On July 25th, 1911, he made his attempt to go over Niagara Falls. And he succeeded. But not without some serious injury and coming very close to death. He broke both of his kneecaps, he broke his jaw. The doctors told him that he was unbelievably lucky to survive this. Later, by the 1920s, now in his 60s, he attempted more dangerous feats. He wanted to swim in the Whirlpool Rapids without, a raft. He failed many times, he was injured many times, and again, he escaped death several times. And then, in 1926, while touring in New Zealand, Bobby Leach would simply slip on an orange peel. He broke his leg, which then required it to be amputated. But then because of that, he got an infection. 2 months later, the infection had spread, and he died. To me, this is someone in the universe saying, you should not have survived Niagara Falls, so we are going to get you now with an orange peel. Needless to say, folks, please do not try anything I've talked about at home. Please don't try to go over a waterfall, any waterfall in a barrel, and don't practice slipping on orange peels either. Thanks. Imagine surviving a mass shooting only to die in one a short time later. Hello, true crimerers. This is Final Destination in real life. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 24-year-old Jessica Redfield. She also went by Jessica Gowie. Jessica was actually an aspiring reporter, specifically a sports reporter. She was described as someone with a huge heart and someone who was very passionate about what she did. On June 12th, 2020, she was in Toronto, Canada. That evening, she was in the food court of the Toronto Eaton Centre, and she was just, buying herself some dinner. At 6:20 p.m., she went and bought herself a hamburger, and she was about to sit down at one of the tables inside the food court, but she said, you know what? It's a nice night outside. I'm going to go outside instead and eat. 3 minutes later, gunfire rang out inside the food court. A 23-year-old man by the name of Christopher Husbands entered the food court and began to fire. He would end up shooting 7 people, where 2 of them would die. He actually turned himself in 2 days later because he was not apprehended that day. He would end up being convicted of this and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Jessica heard all the gunfire happening, and of course, she just felt super lucky to be alive. About a month later, she was in Denver, Colorado. On July 20th, 2012, midnight showings of The Dark Knight Rises were going on throughout the country. That day, she would tweet, "Of course we're seeing The Dark Knight. Red-headed Texan Spitfire. People should never argue with me. Maybe I should get in on those NHL talks." She asks someone, "You aren't seeing it tonight?" I guess they say no. She responds with, "Psh, loser." And then her very final tweet would be, "Movie doesn't start for 20 minutes. Just a few moments after she sent that last tweet, the film had started, and James Holmes had managed to prop open one of the emergency exit doors. He walked out to his car, he geared up with weapons, came back inside, and he began to open fire. I've covered this story in detail before, but we all know it. 12 people would end up losing their lives that night, including 24-year-old Jessica Redfield. Unfortunately, we're in a day and age where we can't say that this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Can lightning strike twice, Unfortunately, nowadays, you cannot survive a mass shooting and say, all right, it's now been my time, it's happened, won't happen again. Because the odds are, it can very much happen again. It is just such a tragedy. She missed her flight, so lucky her, right? No. Hello, true crimerers. This is Final Destination in real life number 11. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was Johanna Ganthaler. In 2009, her and her husband were both retired and they lived in Italy. In May of 2009, they decided to take a vacation to Brazil. The trip itself went wonderful. On June 1st, 2009, they were scheduled to board Air France Flight 447 in Rio de Janeiro, which would be taking them to Paris, France. But they were late to the airport and they missed their flight. 4 hours into Flight 447, the pilots, for some reason, would stall the aircraft and were not able to recover. The plane would then crash into the Atlantic Ocean. There were 228 souls on board, and the plane would end up in fragments. All 228 people on board the plane would die. Johanna and her husband Kurt, they escaped death, but for how long? The very next day, they were able to catch a flight that would go to Munich, Germany. And then the plan was they were going to just rent a car and drive back to Italy. Now, as they were driving, they would go through Kufstein, which is in Austria. Kurt was driving, and for some reason, they had to swerve out of the way of another vehicle, which caused them to cross lanes. They would crash into a truck and spin completely out of control. Johanna and Kurt were then rushed to the hospital. Kurt would have major injuries but would survive, but Johanna, unfortunately, would die. I mean, imagine hearing the news that the plane you were supposed to be on crashed and everyone died. Thinking to yourself, oh my god, we escaped death. This is about as close to a Final Destination movie storyline that I think I've covered so far. An entire basketball team gone in an instant, save for one person. But he wouldn't be so lucky for long. Hello, true crimerers. This is a Final Destination in real life story. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here is the University of Evansville's basketball team from 1977. The Purple Aces were 4 games into their season when on December 13th, 1977, they would board a small plane to head to Tennessee. One player was not on the plane. That was David Furr. He had actually broken his ankle, so he had to stay home while the team traveled. Just moments after Air Indiana Flight 216 took off, the plane would lose control and crash. All 29 souls on board, the entire basketball team, the coaches, staff, and obviously the staff of the plane, all died. Apparently the crash was due to some pilot errors, and I guess the baggage compartment was overloaded. David Furr obviously was devastated that he just lost his entire team, all of his friends, his coaches, gone in just a matter of 2 to 3 minutes. But he was also feeling very fortunate because I would have been on that plane had my ankle not been broken. Exactly 2 weeks to the day after the crash, David and his brother Byron were driving on the freeway, and David was actually behind the wheel, when because of icy roads, he lost control of the vehicle and crashed head-on into another car. David and Byron both died on impact. I believe the people in the other vehicle survived. This is about as close to like a Final Destination plot as you can get. But in all seriousness, it's insane to me how life tends to work.